Jonathan,
Mr.
ready
Johnson,
again.
whenever you're
We
ready,
can
you can go ahead
proceed.
and start.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This is Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. We're very close to the end of this presentation. The final note from Chapter 6 is on different ways in which the plan can be changed following its approval. So, land use plans are often described as living documents, which is meant to imply that they can change or evolve over time in response to changing circumstances or new information. The first and easiest way to make a change to an approved land use plan is called a minor variance. So this is another technical term that refers to a small change to an applicable plan requirement, such as a setback or a seasonal restriction. So for example, if there was a requirement in the plan for certain uses to stay 1 kilometer away from a river, but based on the circumstances, the proponent wanted to go within 800 meters of the river rather than a kilometer, they'd be able to request a minor variance to reduce the setback requirement, or a seasonal restriction as another example. And under the Nunavut Planning and Project Assessment Act and the Nunavut Agreement, the Commission has the ability to consider that request through a very short public process. So in this case, we'd receive notice that someone's requested to reduce one of these requirements. We would post notice and allow interested persons to object to the granting of that variance, and would consider the feedback and then could either grant or not grant the requested variance. There's no requirement to engage with the signatories of the land use plan itself. This process is built into the land use plan and can be done fairly efficiently. But a minor variance is not appropriate for a larger change to the land use plan. So for example, if a company wanted to conduct a prohibited use within a limited use area, that could not be considered through a brief minor variance process. For a change of that type, a plan amendment would be required. Now, plan amendments can be proposed by a project proponent looking to change a requirement of the land use plan in a more significant way, or it could be used to respond to new information. So a good example is if another community besides the city of Iqaluit identified a secondary drinking water supply and wanted to include management of that area in the Nunavut land use plan, they could propose this plan amendment to include that area in the plan. So because these are more significant changes to the content of the land use plan, a more detailed public review may be required to consider those changes, and also approval by the Government of Canada, the Government of Nunavut, and Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated would be required for any of these plan amendments that would be considered. The Commission does have the flexibility to scope the public review of a proposed plan amendment as it feels is appropriate. So if this is a serious change to the plan that requires input from all participants, that could be a longer and more costly process. However, if the required plan amendment or the recommended plan amendment is of a smaller scope, for example, a new park is established and the Commission no longer has jurisdiction within the area, the Commission would be able to conduct a more streamlined version of a public review, post notice that the plan is being considered to be amended. In this case, it's a jurisdictional matter of which the Commission has really no choice, but that could go through a much simpler process. So plan amendments can vary depending on the circumstances of the request. In addition to ongoing minor variances or small adjustments to some plan requirements and plan amendments to respond to either project proponents or other interested participants based on new information, the Nunavut Agreement requires that the Commission's land use plans be reviewed completely, but the time frame is not specified. It's called a periodic review or a full review from time to time. In response to previous drafts of the land use plan, many participants expressed concern with the lack of certainty regarding when such a review would take place. In the 2021 draft plan, the Commission included a new proposal or commitment that the Nunavut Land Use Plan would begin a complete review within 7 years of its approval, and that complete review would be finished within 10 years of the plan's original approval. So given that this planning process has just entered its 15th year, the Commission considered this 7 to 10 year period of review as being a reasonable compromise between some of the time frames that different participants had suggested. We'll note that this periodic review would be a public process and require full engagement and participation of all communities that are affected, as well, of course, as governments, regional Inuit associations, Nunavut Tungavik, industry, non-governmental organizations, all over again. It's also worth noting that this periodic review would also go back and consider the 2007 Broad Planning Policies, Objectives and Goals document that's formed the foundation of this planning process. So that will be a significant undertaking on behalf of the Commission, and the hope is that by identifying this 7 to 10 year time frame for the completion of this review, it will assist both the Commission in our work planning and budgeting with our partners at the federal government, and also allow other participants to prepare for their involvement in this detailed periodic review. So as I mentioned, there are a number of important concepts within Chapter 6, the implementation strategy. We've chosen to highlight a few of them here today to help inform our conversations throughout the week. But we'll conclude our overview of Chapter 6 on that note. And as a final portion of this presentation, before we move to any questions, we'd just like to provide an overview of Map A1, the different land use designations in the area, and then conclude with an overview of the different area calculations. So on slide 66, we can see the southern Iqaluit region, including Sanikiluaq as a separate inset map here. And as a reminder, the red areas are the limited use designations. Sorry, Gumpia, it's number 66. Thanks. The red areas are those limited use designations where there are year-round prohibitions on multiple activities. Starting near Iqaluit and Senarayak, you can see those red areas in the northern Fox Basin. All of those larger areas are the different community areas of interest. In addition, there are some smaller red locations within that region corresponding to different military facilities. Coming down through Fox Basin, you also see a large red limited use area identified for key migratory bird habitats in the area. These again have year-round restrictions on certain activities as well as setback requirements. Moving down onto Baffin Island, you can see Netling Lake, more in the center of the island, another community area of interest that moves into a series of different migratory bird habitats, including a migratory bird sanctuary that then turns into further south an important caribou habitat that was identified by the Iqaluit Wildlife Board. All of these areas along that coast are included as limited use areas. Jumping back up to near Qikiqtarjuaq, the red limited use areas there correspond to the different national wildlife areas and additional key migratory bird habitats surrounding the national wildlife areas. Down near Cumberland Sound in the community of Pengnutung, we have the turbot fishing area, as well as different whale habitats and drinking water supplies near the community that are included as limited use areas. Out along the coast, there are some smaller red dots corresponding to different walrus haul-out sites that we've discussed today. Moving down south of the Cumberland Sound, we also see additional red areas as limited use, which is additional caribou habitat, again identified by the Iqaluit Wildlife Board. And on this map, you can see a portion of the Chidliak Diamond Project that overlaps, shown in a black outline on the peninsula. And again, more walrus haul-outs towards Baffin Bay. And then near Iqaluit, we again have more caribou habitat to the west, along with the Katanalik Territorial Park and the Soper River watershed that extends beyond. And additionally, between Iqaluit and Kingate, we have another key migratory bird habitat site. Then moving on to the inset map near Iqaluit, there are extensive limited use designations within the Belcher Islands. The largest areas are identified for key migratory bird habitats. And within those areas that are hard to see on this map, there are also additional walrus haul-out sites. Moving on to conditional use areas, we do note much of the coastal orange areas are due to polar bear denning, including in the area of equal use and occupancy around Salisbury and Nottingham Islands are identified as polar bear denning habitat. And the additional large conditional use area at the mouth of Frobisher Bay is coming from a key migratory bird habitat site where only setbacks would apply. So at a very high level, I've just tried to summarize some of the key land use designations that apply within this region. And I'll now skip back to slide 63, which has the area calculations broken down not only for the whole territory, but based on a regional distribution. And these are calculated for the Iqaluit region generally, although we don't have all communities of the Iqaluit here with us today, having previously met in Pond Inlet with the 5 North Baffin communities. We do just have the overall 3 regional breakdowns provided. Also, area calculations for overlap with existing mineral rights and Inuit-owned lands, both surface and subsurface. So you'll recall 65% of the entire territory was mixed use, 9% conditional use, and 22% limited use. Within the Iqaluit region generally, there is slightly more mixed use areas, closer to 70% rather than 65%. And you can see the breakdowns for both terrestrial and marine areas within the Iqaluit region. In terms of mineral rights, you can see that Nunavut wide, about 37% of existing mineral rights are within limited use areas. Again, where those exceptions from prohibitions would apply based on Appendix A. And that moves to about 33% here in the Iqaluit region. The bottom section of this table identifies overlaps with Inuit-owned lands, both surface and subsurface. You can see from a surface perspective, the 31% of Inuit-owned lands are within a limited use designation, but that significantly drops to only 12% here in the Iqaluit region. During our previous hearings, the Commission has heard prominent concerns about the overlap of limited use designations with Inuit-owned lands, and we just highlight the reduction in the amount of overlap here in the Iqaluit region compared to other regions of Nunavut. Likewise, for subsurface lands, which the Commission understands were primarily selected for economic potential, Nunavut-wide, the overlap with limited use sits at close to 43%, but here in the Iqaluit, a little over 25%. Again, there's a lot of detail included here. The Commission has released this information through question and answer documents. Different participants have different interests, and we hope that these consistently calculated area percentages have been helpful to participants in their review of the 2021 Nunavut Land Use Plan. At this point, I'll stop our overview of the draft plan, turn it back to our chairperson, and we can hopefully respond to any questions that you may have for us today. Thank you very much.
Me, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan. Each day, once there's been a presentation, the communities can ask questions. Raise your hands. And after the question, then Nunavut will have an opportunity. And when they're done, other members, signatories to the hearing, whether they have comments or questions. And from the public, if there are public comments, first, raise your hands. We'll write your name down. Jitalu. Thank you. We'll go through the list of names. State your name and your organization, who you represent. And mention who you are here with. Currently, we can ask 2 questions. If we finish early, we can go to more questions if you have more questions. If we haven't gone through the materials, we can meet in the evening from 6 to 9. First of all, Jitalu wanted to ask a question. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm Jitalu Kakki from Iqaluit, Amarok Hunters and Trappers. I'm an elder now. We often want to speak with the opportunity, my question in the red, limited use, where does that come from? And the setback of a kilometer, that if you present an example, I don't quite understand the setback. I would like more clarification on my two questions. If it's designated red, that is protected, whether the limited use category. Thank you. Thank you. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. Thank you very much for your questions. The red limited use areas, as we said, are the most restrictive type of land use designations included in the land use plan. So for each issue that was identified, whether it was walrus haulouts or polar bear denning areas or any other issue, the Commission very carefully considered all of the different factors that related to the management of those areas, and then considered which option would be most appropriate for a given issue. So limited use areas require the year-round prohibition or restriction of a given activity. So in some areas, like caribou calving habitat, the Commission chose an option that would restrict or not allow certain activities throughout the whole year. So when they considered the sensitivity and value of caribou calving habitat, they chose a limited use designation to prohibit activities all year round. In other cases, like polar bear denning, the interest or value was there seasonally, and it was thought that activities could occur outside of denning season safely. So it was a seasonal restriction that commissioners preferred, and under the framework of the land use plan, that made it a conditional use area. It's not all year round. So for each topic, commissioners carefully considered what information was available and how land use could be managed to respond to concerns about those different values. And in some cases, they landed on limited use with year-round restrictions, sometimes as conditional use with maybe seasonal restrictions, and sometimes as a valued component where there was no specific guidance. So in terms of where the limited use designations came from, it was all dependent on the information the Commission had on hand as to the value of the area and the different options that were considered for how to manage land use within those areas. For your second question on setbacks, a good example are the walrus haulouts. So setback is a minimum distance that you need to stay away from certain features. So here in the city, your house or a shed or a garage may need to be set back from the road, right? Like you can't build a house right on the road. It has to be a certain distance from the road, and that's called a setback. So we've used the same concept throughout all of Nunavut, but not for houses and roads, but for other types of land use and different values. So on a walrus haul-out, the Commission received very detailed information that aircraft, for example, the noise can startle the walrus that are hauled out on the land. So in general, an aircraft can fly over a walrus haul-out, but they have to stay very high. So that's a form of a setback or a minimum altitude. We also heard that boats of different sizes approaching a walrus haul-out could also startle or disturb the animals when they're grouped together on the shoreline. So depending on the size of the ship, there are different setbacks or distances that the ship has to stay away from the haul-out. So for example, if a large cruise ship was coming near, it would have to stay a larger distance away, but then they could launch smaller, Zodiac-style inflatable boats, for example, that could come closer, but still not right up to the shore. So those setbacks are the term we use for how far away different types of land uses would have to stay from the value, in this case, the shoreline where the walrus are grouped together. Thank you.
Thank you. Sharon was going to add. Sharon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sharon Hallowack, Executive Director with the Nunavut Planning Commission, and thank you for your questions. I just want to ensure that everyone knows that the land use designations doesn't impact Inuit rights or Inuit hunting rights. As outlined in the Nunavut Agreement, all those rights stay the same. They're not impacted at all. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. To add, the walrus haul-outs, any Inuit can approach a walrus haul-out, but it relates to tourists and outsiders. Inuit rights would not be affected in any way, even if it's a red, as stated in the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement. Thank you. Jacoby? Thank you. My question.
The question was, who put the boundaries on? Oh, sorry. Jacoby,
I have to remind us, I'm Secretary Manager of the HTO Iqaluit.
He was asking who put the boundaries on the red areas. That's his question. And variance, how far a kilometer is or a mile? What you mentioned those areas like a kilometer. How far is that? Can you point that out? Because he doesn't know kilometers or miles. My question is, I have a map which was done by Iqaluit HCO board, and I would like to be included with this draft or whatever. I don't know who to give it to, so we would like to have this included in Nunavut plan, use plan. Nunavut plan, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Sharon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sharon Hallowack, Executive Director with the Planning Commission. Jacoby, thank you for your comments. With your presentation, when it comes up to the HTO for Iqaluit, you will be able to do your presentation and do your submission both orally and in writing, and it will become part of the record. And not just at these hearings, but up to if you have more submissions or information that any community member would like to provide. After the public hearing, you can do so again up until January 10th. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your question.
Thank you. Jonathan, you want to clarify?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. Thank you for clarifying on the previous question. I didn't understand the question about where the boundaries came from. So in general, the Commission has relied upon the best available information to set all of the different boundaries in the draft plan. So as I indicated through some of the presentation, that information often came from the Iqaluit Wildlife Board, who work directly with the hunters and trappers organizations of the region. For example, the community on-ice travel routes, the caribou habitat information, that came from hunters and trappers through the Iqaluit Wildlife Board. Some boundaries came from the Canadian Wildlife Service with Environment and Climate Change Canada for key migratory bird habitat sites. Some information the Commission prepared itself, including things like community drinking water supplies. We mapped those ourselves. So everyone's input was considered, and the Commission relied on the best information it had, whether that was individual community members, hunters and trappers organizations like the map that you've brought here with you, or from government agencies that conduct their own work. So the Commission has relied on all of that information to inform how these boundaries were drawn. And regarding the 1 kilometer, I used that as an example. Some setbacks are different, and I'm not very good in miles, but I think it's like 1 kilometer is about 2/3 or 60-some% of a mile. I'm not sure how helpful that is, but yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sharon Halawak, Executive Director with the Planning Commission. Also, with regards to how the red zones became about, we also have done, since 2003, use and occupancy mapping. Brian and his team over the years have gone in and collected from individual Inuit throughout the communities the information, and that is also recorded and collected on the data sets. And as John said in his presentation, there's over 10,000 data sets that have been collected and included directly from Inuit within the communities and elders. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Sharon.
Johnny Mike?
Johnny Mike?
Thank
you.
Johnny Mac, you Panak to it, Umedolo Gwinit, Mako never put a soft no.
2 questions.
Tema, Kaujamata.
As we are aware, economic opportunities through fishing, through turbot or char, that was mentioned. I think there's 4 communities that are affected. for communities that have worked turbot and shrimp. The Hunters and Trappers Association is part of this. I don't see it here. I understand. It's only for the Nunavut settlement area. Maybe this might be outside. First, I want to understand. That's first question. Thank you. Thank you. Jonathan?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. Thanks, Johnny, for your question regarding commercial fisheries. The Commission is aware of different areas that are being used by communities and industry in general for commercial fishing. We've attempted to include those as generally as valued components for consideration by others. As you note, many of those areas are outside of the Nunavut settlement area and are not shown on our maps, but the area of Cumberland Sound in particular was included as a limited use area for its important to your community's fishery. I just want to take the opportunity to add that the Nunavut Land Use Plan does not have the ability to restrict or provide any requirements for commercial fisheries in general. That's the responsibility of the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board. So our consideration of commercial fisheries is in identifying areas that are important fishing areas and providing management for other uses that may also be occurring in the area in order to protect the future sustainability of the fisheries. So that's just an extra clarification I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you. Johnny? Thank you. Mr. Chairman, do I have to state Johnny Mike, Pangnaktu Hunters and Trappers Organization? I too was part of the discussions. We have been going through this process with communities as community reps. Jagwa, I just want to note the communities and how when you looked at shrimp and turbot, from Pangnaktu, we heard within the hamlet boundaries, within the municipality, the land that had already been designated otherwise, where the Anglican and the Hudson's Bay and the police owned land, and that preceded the land claim, and this is still in effect. Under Section 11 of the land claim, 1142 seems to be related to this, that NPC doesn't have the jurisdiction but when we cannot purchase land now, although we have been here and within the hamlet for a long time, only those organizations that I mentioned own land within the municipality. It seems that when we started negotiations through the land claim, we did mention these lands through the land claim that they would, under Article 11 regarding the Nunavut Planning Commission, I feel we have some avenues on this, and we're told that this issue would be discussable. For me, through the process of land claims to date, that issue I bring forward, it seems that I live in Pangnakto. I mentioned their private lands. We're short of building space for houses. We have limited land available around the community. If we thought in Pangnakto to try and access those lands, Mr. Chairman, I know it was mentioned, but it's outside of your jurisdiction. But looking under Section 11, that there's a clause there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. Thank you very much, Johnny. We understand your concern with land ownership within the municipality, in particular from the Anglican Church, Hudson Bay, as well as the RCMP and its potential restrictions on the community's ability to further develop. It's our understanding that that's not something that the Nunavut Planning Commission can address, and we do note that there are other agencies here today, including the Government of Nunavut, their Community and Government Services, that may be able to provide some options for how to address this, but I don't think that's something that's within our mandate. Thank you.
You will have an opportunity in your community presentations to speak to whatever issue you want to bring up regarding today's presentation. Paul, state your name and thank you, Paul Kwasa from the city of Iqaluit, City Councillor. My question, military facilities and the contaminated sites left by the military. Those are identified and we know where they are. And we know Iqaluit here was a base that they've gone through the process of remediation and cleanup. Same thing happened here in Iqaluit, but it's not identified. It too has been contaminated on towards the upper base. That I used to work up the hill up there. Their buildings are gone, but we know that there's contamination there, but I notice it's not listed here. I just note that, how or what the status of this one. Thank you. Thank you. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. Thank you very much, Paul, for your question. I don't have all of the details in front of me as to the current status of that particular location, but I do note that the Commission has made attempts to limit the impacts of its land use designations within municipal boundaries. So it's possible that the areas may have been removed that were within municipal boundaries, but I'm speculating and maybe offer to follow up on that particular location, not having the specific details in front of me right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben. Thank you, Chair. I have questions. You have mentioned in your presentation, Nunavut Planning Commission, once this process is over and once approved, as discussed by Nunavut population, says that it will become a law. How will you be able to regulate with so many proponents, as you have mentioned in the maps today, that there are so numerous, many concerns? So how will you be able to regulate? I'd like to know what procedure have set for future regulation that you will keep for the proponents. So tell us as we sit on the table.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. Thank you very much, Ben, for your question. The requirements of the Nunavut Land Use Plan, as you say, will be law once it's approved. Now, the Nunavut Planning Commission, as I've noted, serves as the front door or the entry point into Nunavut's regulatory system, and the land use plan requirements are a first layer of requirements that proponents need to follow. I also noted that we pass our decisions on to all other regulatory authorities that have a mandate to authorize the project. So the enforcement and implementation of the requirements of the land use plan is somewhat of a shared responsibility with other regulatory authorities as well. So if the Nunavut Land Use Plan includes setbacks or seasonal requirements, then those details get passed on to other regulatory authorities that actually issue licenses, permits, and other authorizations. So whether that's the Nunavut Impact Review Board through their screening decisions or project certificates, whether that's a Nunavut Water Board license, a land use permit issued by the landowner, or perhaps even something from the government of Nunavut like a wildlife observation permit. So for a setback around a walrus haul-out, that could be incorporated into the wildlife observation permit that the government of Nunavut's Department of Environment may issue. So all of these requirements trickle down and get incorporated as the base level of requirement into other organizations' authorizations. They, of course, can add additional requirements based on their own review of the project, but the requirements of the land use plan must be incorporated by those other agencies. Now that addresses how they get implemented, but enforcement and inspection and monitoring is a different process and layer to the system. So right now, the Commission doesn't have inspectors, for example, on staff. We don't do site visits to verify that these requirements are being followed. But other regulatory authorities do. So under the Nunavut Planning and Project Assessment Act, the federal government has a primary role in monitoring and inspection and enforcement, and they would be conducting their assessment of the project, keeping in mind the requirements of the land use plan. Likewise, the Nunavut Impact Review Board for major projects does inspections as well. The Commission does understand that there's currently a lack of inspection officers and regular site visits for many projects across the territory. They do take place, but community members regularly inform the Commission that it's not adequate. We often hear from communities that community members, that they have seen activities taking place that were not appropriate, for example. And one of our priorities, once we complete this Nunavut land use plan, is to develop a more robust communication protocol with communities in order to inform them of activities that have been authorized in the territory and what requirements those projects are under, and provide a point of contact, at least, for community concerns relating to activities that they've observed that they do not feel are appropriate. So I apologize for a bit of a long-winded answer, but in general, it is kind of a shared responsibility, and the Planning Commission plays an important role, but we can't do any of this by ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Ben Kubik, Mao HTO.
Thanks for a long-winded answer. I'll accept that.
The other question I have relates to, I don't think you're responsible for freshwater responsibilities or the islands along the bay. For instance, water haul-outs, I don't think that's your responsibility. I fail to understand you there. and to bird sanctuaries. And I don't think that it's your responsibility. I just want clarifications, for instance, here in Iqaluit, you have heard from us the Power Corps have planned to do some dam building for power. We have heard many things, and it's up to the public, the population, to determine if a dam should be built for cheaper power. Underwater power sources possible. I don't believe you have any powers related to that second project that the Power Corp have in mind. Are you responsible for only land surface? And one more question. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. Thank you, Ben, for your second question. I would like to clarify that the Nunavut Planning Commission, through our land use plans, do have jurisdiction within waters as well. So both freshwater lakes and rivers, as well as marine areas. So although the Nunavut Water Board, for example, has the responsibility for managing the use and deposit of waste into fresh water, the Planning Commission does have jurisdiction over these areas as well. So within freshwater and the marine environment, that is all subject to the Nunavut land use plan. So a hydroelectric, like a dam for power generation, that is something that would need to conform to or be supported by the Nunavut land use plan if it's approved. So I noted many of the limited use designations proposed to prohibit or not allow hydroelectric power generation. So those projects would be reviewed against an approved Nunavut land use plan. And in the marine environment, I gave those examples of setbacks from a walrus haul out or different requirements for whale calving areas. Those areas are subject to the jurisdiction of the Nunavut land use plan. Thank you.
As I mentioned, I'm going to allow 2 questions per person. Later on, if we have time, I'm going to get back to you. So I'm going to ask delegates from Nunavut to see if you have a question. We have one. Thank you, Johnny Kasalua Kinukchuak, Nunavut. I'll try to keep my questions short. Due to climate change, and I don't see much discussion today to this particular project as it goes worse, and it has affected animals in our land, and the problem appears to be getting worse, and the mammals are starting to suffer. For instance, we have been seeing species that are not residents to our community lately, perhaps due to climate change. I think it should be part of your program your planning session, your planning program, and the people. And Inuit have need to practice their survival for wildlife. I don't see anything in your discussion today, your presentation, so I would like clarification that will be in protection of animals. So it's going to get worse if they are not protected one way or the other, and I didn't hear this in your presentation today. And we need to hear how safeguards would be in place. And the organizations who represent and our society today, the land use plan that you have presented today, it looks very good in paper. And there's one word that we have not heard today, to see if there was a conflict today. And I have seen your website. So what preparations have you done in order to ensure that your presentations are carried through? And I need to know how everything will progress in your draft land use plan. And when it becomes a reality, how will the public, the way of life of Inuit people, is it a priority in your draft land use plan? What safeguards are there to preserve Inuit culture? What about companies who will expend huge amount of money, and should they take priority? And Inuit way of life perhaps would be put in the back burner, perhaps even Nunavut wildlife. We need to speak what our priorities are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. Thank you, Johnny, for your questions that you've raised today. On the first topic of climate change, I do note that although there are no specific slides within the presentation we've provided today, there is a section in Chapter 2, Section 2.9 of the draft plan that does discuss climate change and how it was considered throughout the development of the land use plan. I gave examples of the impacts of a changing climate on caribou and polar bear as examples of how the increased sensitivity or vulnerability of these species was considered by commissioners when making the strong recommendations to protect different habitats for those species in particular. And I would like to note that the Commission has heard a great deal about the changing climate and different environmental factors that are impacting people, but also wildlife in the territory, changing distributions of species, having grizzly bears, for example, move further into Nunavut and now interacting more and more with polar bears. These types of issues the Commission could expect to continue, and that fits in well with the idea of land use plans being this term of living documents that change over time in response to new information or new circumstances. So while the current draft plan doesn't have land use designations or plan requirements directly related to climate change, it has been a factor in the development of this plan, and it can be considered in the future through plan amendments or those periodic 7 to 10 year reviews that I had also mentioned. Regarding how this process will progress and the priority given to Inuit way of life, I will note that all of the information that's been received already and that is being heard through this final hearing will all be given great weight and consideration by commissioners when they revise the current draft plan in 2023. So all of these hearings, written submissions, oral comments will all be used to directly inform revisions to this draft of the land use plan that will then make up a recommended land use plan that will be submitted to the Government of Canada, the Government of Nunavut, as well as Nunavut-Tungavik Incorporated for consideration. Finally, on the importance of the Inuit way of life and cultural priorities, I note that under the Nunavut Agreement, the Commission is mandated to give great weight to the views of communities of the planning region and to give full consideration, for example, to Inuit Kaimayutikongit, in addition to Western science. And in this draft plan, the Commission has demonstrated a commitment to ensuring the well-being of Nunavut and adjacent communities going forward through, in particular, things like the community areas of interest that have been identified as supporting community health and well-being, in addition to protecting or managing important habitat for species that are of great cultural importance. So this includes, of course, caribou, fish, marine mammals, polar bear, all of the efforts in the draft plan to protect and manage land use in these areas important to these vital species were arrived at in consideration of the strong views of communities in this planning process, that these species are important to community health and well-being now and into the future. So maybe I'll stop there and turn it back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no more names.
Any question from the registered participant? I don't see any hand.
Anyone from the public? Step up to the microphone. State your name, and you have 2 questions. Can you hear me? Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Inuit
from
katutsigi
Kikaktan
katigi
Inuit
kunni kanayak
Association.
tiudlunga tallugutiu imangano
I work
amarunaw
on the
toksoktino
Lancaster Sound
aratiyudlunga
and
ullumikisiani
the wildlife watchers.
abatitinu kamanang mo ilin
I am also taking a course. Thank you for the opportunity, and my fellow students are here. I try not to go too fast here. Thank you for the work leading up that has been made public to us and available. My question in terms of the land claims agreement, sea mammals, white whales, bowhead whales are a priority, but it doesn't list bowhead whales as a priority. I would like the Nunavut land use plan to include bowhead whales as a priority animal. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This is Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. Thank you for the comments. I would like to note that in this most recent version of the draft plan, bowhead calving areas have been included. So in previous drafts, we only had information included on beluga calving areas, and in 2021, this section of the draft plan 2.5 has been expanded to include both narwhal and bowhead calving areas in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the response. Jonathan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. Apologies, I heard bowhead as the species through interpretation. Yes, so far in this process, orcas or killer whales have not been identified as a priority, so we certainly do appreciate your feedback. And following up from the previous question on climate change, we do understand that they're becoming more common within Nunavut waters each year, and that's something that the Commission will be giving consideration to moving forward. So thank you for that, and apologies for the confusion.
Thank you. I have no more names from the floor. Ben? Sorry? There is a speaker.
Hello, James.
James Kidlock. Iqaluit Wildlife Board. Regarding the presentation, the hamlet and the government have rights following the land claims, the HTO and NTI, which weight do you give the hamlet's rights where they cannot go beyond the municipal boundaries? How about for the HTO how do you weigh the two differences when you're talking about rights? That is my question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. Thank you for the question. I understand the concern to be around differences between municipal rights and jurisdiction as compared to hunters and trappers organizations, for example. I want to note that the Nunavut Planning Commission itself does not have the authority or ability to limit the municipal or hamlet rights in terms of their jurisdiction. I made reference a few times today perhaps to hamlets or municipal councils having jurisdiction within municipal boundaries and not having jurisdiction outside of them, in the context of community drinking water supplies as an example. So that extent of jurisdiction is not set by the Nunavut Planning Commission. We have heard repeated requests from municipalities, for example, to expand their municipal boundaries. And again, note that that's not something the Commission has authority over. In terms of hunters and trappers organizations' rights, again, I would note that the Nunavut Planning Commission has no authority to impact or reduce harvesting rights, for example, that extend to other areas. So, as we've said multiple times today, the requirements of the land use plan are specifically not intended to apply to community land users and hunters and trappers organizations, both in terms of jurisdiction and limiting harvesting in any way, or through anything like quotas or those sorts of measures that are handled by the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board. So perhaps I've misunderstood the question, but just want to note that the Planning Commission does not have the ability to limit the extent of jurisdiction of hamlets or hunters and trappers organizations in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to add, we're here to listen from all of you. We will consider your comments, communities, comments from the government and various organizations that come to speak. We're here to listen. We will have to discuss these issues as the Commission. Those are understandable. If there are additional questions.
Do you want to ask a question? Go ahead.
Mike Ferguson, Krigatalik Wildlife Board. I have two questions. One is that goal 2 of the land use planning effort is to help protect the critical importance of sustainability of Nunavut's communities and Inuit culture. Inuit wildlife harvesting by Inuit has been sustainable, arguably, for 3,500 years. But we know that the resources around any given community are different. They vary over time. The accessibility of those resources to the Inuit also vary between communities and over time. one of the criteria is, I'm trying to get my papers through, but I think it's that Jonathan referred to earlier. The first criteria is the overall importance of an issue that has been identified. And he used the example where caribou had been identified as an issue for many communities, but muskoxen had not been. And therefore, my understanding is that muskoxen were not dealt with fully, if that's the right word, in the Nunavut Land Use Plan. In the North Baffin communities, Griesfjord especially raised issue with that. When QWB did its review, it identified quite a few areas as what we called multiple value areas. These are areas where there's sufficient resources of different species in a geographic area that make that area very important to the local community. But the specific species varied between each area, depending on what was there. I'm wondering if the Nunavut Planning Commission is willing to rethink their very first criteria about trying to mainly deal with issues that are common among many communities and not focus on how important the resources or an area is to a given community, because you may miss protecting a lot of areas for quite a few communities, because each community is unique in the resources it has available.
Jonathan, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. Thank you, Mike, for the comments and questions. I think it's fair to say in response to the direct question that, of course, the Nunavut Planning Commission is willing to reconsider all aspects of the 2021 draft Nunavut Land Use Plan in response to the feedback that is being received and has been received. On the specific subjects you mentioned, I would note that the very detailed submissions provided by the Iqaluit Wildlife Board were really instrumental in informing revisions to the 2016 draft plan, and many of the submissions have been directly incorporated into the 2021 draft Nunavut Land Use Plan. Some areas that have been identified in those 2018 submissions were not fully incorporated through land use designations into the current 2021 draft Nunavut Land Use Plan, and in some cases that was based on a lack of fulsome discussion and consideration throughout the entirety of the record. So areas like caribou calving habitat that had been identified were incorporated into a much broader discussion that had been ongoing for 15 years. And in some cases, areas that were identified in 2018 by the Iqaluit Wildlife Board were not able to be incorporated into an existing fulsome discussion and consideration in the same format as the remainder of the issues in the options and recommendations document. So in general, the Commission has required to go through this similar exercise of evaluating these 6 criteria, evaluating the preferred options, and in some cases, the information at the time of drafting of the 2021 draft plan was not sufficient to allow a fulsome and consistent analysis as with other issues. As we said, of course, willing to reconsider all of that information on the basis of new and additional feedback that's being received. And I'd also indicate the interest in addressing what we have called priority issues, going back to work from 2007 and 2008 up to today. So while there is that offhand example I gave of having caribou feature prominently in the land use plan but not muskoxen, or having polar bear fully incorporated but not grizzly bear, that is on some level a practical reality of preparing a first generation Nunavut land use plan that is not capable of responding to all issues. So there will be topics that are raised through this planning process that may not be addressed in this first generation land use plan, but the Commission has attempted to identify those areas and values in the options and recommendations document as areas of future work, and there is an ongoing commitment to continue land use planning discussions and exercises with communities and participants across the territory and beyond once this first generation plan is approved. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there and note that we do appreciate all of the detailed information that's been provided. It has been very helpful in the development of the plan, and all of it will be reconsidered following the close of the record in January of 2023. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please recognize the time, but I don't get a whole lot of other questions, but please do ask the question and make sure you make your question to the point and short. Thank you.
Okay. Kuyanami Iqaluit, and thank you, Jonathan. This one is more specific. It's regarding on-ice travel routes, and I just may be misreading this, but it says in this summarized document that on-ice travel routes will not be destroyed in the seasons of Upingaksak and Upingsak without consultation with the hamlet councils, HEOs, etc. I find that a little confusing. So in my reading of that, that means that if a proponent is going to destroy or break ice during spring and late winter, they need to talk to the HTOs and councils. But if they propose to break ice early or in the winter, the core of the winter, Ukiaksak, Ukiak, and Ukiuk, they do. My understanding is that they would not need to talk to the councils and the HTOs. Is that my correct reading of this clause?
Jonathan?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This is Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission. Yes, Mike, I believe you're reading the clause correctly, and if that approach does not meet the expectations or requirements of the Kikitalik Wildlife Board, that's a great example of where feedback can be provided, and commissioners will give full consideration to that following the close of the record. Thank you.
Kuya Namik, taonang isasamayo ka niya Beth, you want to give him a mic? Oh, tayo makinakit. Kuya Namik, sa kinguya, namasimiman, tana unikakaw, Jonathan Kuberi Yarot.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your presentation today.
Kuya Namik, tana ulumi, anigo kene makiseni Sharon ukakena
Through. Sharon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No. Yoo-hoo. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple housekeeping items. We'll be starting again tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. We won't be having an evening session. However, for the community delegates, if you can just stay behind and see Brian for a few minutes, that would be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll start again tomorrow, 9 a.m. Thank you.